Well, thanks for joining us. You're about to hear a story, I believe, of phenomenal grace and reconciliation, hope, forgiveness, all because of Jesus. As I was doing background for this, and Reese was telling me this story, and he's describing what happened with his ex-wife, Sharon, I told him, this sounds like Corrie ten Boom in the level of grace and mercy that she showed. We're not saying this is prescriptive for every couple. This is a story of great brokenness that led to great sin, that led to great forgiveness. And the one true hero in the story is Jesus, the mercy he gives us and the mercy he calls out to others. But I think you'll be inspired. I think you'll be encouraged. And I hope some of you will see Jesus for the first time and also realize the power of the gospel to overcome sin, the power of forgiveness to bring joy, reconciliation, and healing into our life. And we have God to thank for that. So let me introduce who you're seeing. We have Reese and Wendy, and we have Tim and Sharon. They're on vacation together, which may not seem odd until you realize that Reese used to be married to Sharon. And so we're going to have a story of what happened, how as a couple, they still are very close friends, the forgiveness that followed and whatnot. So Reese, let me begin. How long were you and Sharon married?
We were actually only married for about, what was it? I guess when we signed on the dotted line, it would have been 9 years officially married, but a lot of the stuff that happened around the 5-6 year mark.
How many of those 9 years were you faithful to Sharon?
5.
Digitally and physically, how many of those years were you faithful?
Right. No, I would say from the time that we were married to the time when everything fell apart, I would say probably 5.5 years.
Okay. Now, you had a pretty tough upbringing. You were broken as a boy. You want to give just a glimpse of that and what resulted from that?
Sure. As a child in elementary school, I was heavily bullied. And I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to school. I couldn't go home because the same bullies at school actually lived on my block. And so I was always treated with a lot of contempt, a lot of teasing, taunting. I was overweight. And so I was called all of the nicknames that would go along with that, fatso, tubblard, things like that. I was an easy target for some reason. I didn't understand why. But I was treated like that for probably about 6 or 7 years of my upbringing, probably about 3rd grade to 8th grade. And it was a very fearful time for me. The interesting thing about that was that these same kids who would tease and taunt and beat me up would also come back around and say, hey, you want to come play kickball? You know, if they needed a warm body for the teams, or, hey, we're about jumping our ramps with our bikes. You want to come out or go on a bike ride or whatever. And it was very confusing, but I wanted to be their friend, so I would join in. And then they would turn on a dime, and the next thing I know, I'm now the target of this taunting and teasing and being beaten up. And so I learned at a very young age that I can't trust anybody.
Yeah.
They're going to love you one day and they're going to stab you in the back the next. And that followed me for decades. I also wasn't really accepted by my peers in school. I was always the last one chosen for any kind of sporting events at recess. And I would always hear this thing constantly because it wasn't even that I was chosen, it was process of elimination. And this is one thing that always stuck out to me. I would always hear these kids say at the end of choosing the teams, oh, great, now we're going to lose. And that constantly fed my soul.
Yeah.
So that was a lot to take in. And then there was kind of this emptiness at home, at least from an emotional standpoint. I wasn't very emotionally connected with my mom and dad. My dad was gone quite a bit, and my mom worked retail hours. And so I was home alone, even as a very young child, very isolated, and then living in fear because I couldn't go out of my house, for fear that I would be seen and would be the target of bullying again. So it was just a constant cycle over and over and over again.
Sharon, how did you see this in your marriage with Reese? Did you know about this before you got married? How did it exhibit itself, if you did?
He was very open with me as we were dating. but we were in a very interesting season at the church that he was leading worship at, where we were having altar calls every Sunday, and people were crying and really truly getting healed. We were hearing lots of testimonies in that day of people's lives being radically changed. And Maurice, after hours playing music for these altar calls, he would get to come down and get prayer. And I saw God doing a work in his life, and I just had utmost faith that God was doing a work. And I do believe he did. But I think there was just that level of faith that God was healing. And I really believed that we were being called together. And I'm sure there was a little bit of naivete in all of that. But that's just where my heart was at, that God was going to heal his past. And I'm sure there was a little bit of fixer in me, as a lot of women have, and, that we would conquer anything. So that's pretty much how I went into the marriage.
Would you describe the first 5 years as fairly happy years for a newlywed couple?
I think it was very mixed. I was broken myself going into it, so I really was looking to Reese to really fulfill parts of me that felt broken. So I was kind of living in his shadow. He was very celebrated worship leader, very loved. So just by association, I felt very loved, very seen. I felt like I belonged because of who he was. So I was kind of living on his coattails a lot of those 5 years and finding fulfillment in that. As far as the marriage, I think right away we saw that, there are some problems here. Fire married water. And it was just an interesting mix. And there were good times, but definitely challenges from the start.
Now, Reese, your current occupation, you work with a lot of men who have sexual addictions.
I do.
And you've shared that was a part of your own past. When did that develop, and how did it impact your marriage?
It happened early on in my life. I became very aware of pornography at around the age of 11. And this was kind of in the midst of my bullying and my emotional brokenness that was starting.
It's just a toxic mix right there.
Right. It's like a perfect storm. And there was this dumpster behind a convenience store where we always knew that we would find a pornographic magazine discarded. And that just became my cycle. Go there, get a magazine, tear out some pages, bring it home. And then you learned a little bit at that moment about how to sexually self-gratify. And that just became the cycle of my life, starting at age 11 and going for the next 35 years. It would be porn addiction and sex addiction. I would go to strip clubs. I would go to video stores and rent videos. I would be very active in my dating relationships. I wasn't like this hookup king, but I was a person that once I got involved in a relationship, it had to be sexual right away, even if it wasn't, a married situation. I was only married once before all of that. But I had to engage with that because, one, it made me feel accepted. But two, the addiction was there. And we all know what that feels like if we do deal with addiction, the arousal, the dopamine rush, that whole thing that goes along with it. So I had to continue that as well. So that really was my whole life for literally 35 years. So
how active was that during the first 5 years when you met Sharon? I mean, sometimes I've talked to guys and it abates for a little bit in the flush of early marriage. Did that happen for you, or did you bring that right into your marriage and it never really?
It did abate for a while because it's new, it's novel. Now it's legal. And you get to enjoy that level of it that you've been searching for your whole life. But you're correct. It was one of those things that eventually, when everything kind of faded off and the newness faded off, there was this desire for more, this hunger that would shoot back up in me. And I started getting back into it. These were the days where the computers weren't what they are now.
Right. Yeah.
So you had to wait quite a bit for a download of a picture or a video. And this was also the days where you actually paid for any kind of pornographic material online. And so a lot of that kept that out of range for a little while because it just was too much. It was too long. So it was kind of relying on mental imagery, thinking about other women, thinking about scenes from pornographic movies or magazines that I had seen that were really impactful to me. And I just kept living in that fantasy realm, and it really, really fired up around that time. Just probably a year or so into the marriage.
And that's so often what I hear, 9 months to a year or so. A guy thinks he's cured, but if he hasn't dealt with the issues,
right,
when sex becomes a little bit routine. So when you said you were faithful to her for 5 years, I mean, technically
not.
There wasn't much of a marriage
right,
when you were cherishing Sharon
right,
exclusively. Sharon, did you notice that? Did you feel that? I mean, you've been married to two different guys now. Do you sense a difference when your husband has this going off on the side, even if you don't see it? Does it impact what's happening in the bedroom?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't understand what was happening. He definitely kept it a secret. But there was a very definitive line to when sex was exciting and good and pure and holy. And I felt the holiness, and we would even put worship on during our times, to when it felt very unholy. It felt dirty, and I didn't want it. And I didn't know I thought it was my problem, that it was hormonal, or just because of our brokenness and because of what was going on in our marriage. I just didn't have a desire for it. So yeah, there was definitely a definitive line where it went from feeling very holy to very dirty. And I didn't understand it.
Just for those who are watching, you say as a pastor, this is so common that a guy has something going on that really distorts and pollutes his ability to cherish his wife sexually. He can perform sexually, although even that can be compromised at times. But the wife senses something is different here. This isn't what it used to be. And notice what Sharon did. Maybe I don't like sex. Maybe something's wrong with me. It's not that Sharon wasn't into sex. She wasn't into sex that's perverted because the husband isn't engaging in it in a holy way, where Hebrews says, let the marriage bed be kept pure. So she, as a healthy person, wouldn't be able to enjoy that kind of sexual intimacy. The problem wasn't her. The problem was what was happening when she wasn't around. And so you two had a baby. When did baby number one come in?
2000.
So that was how many years into your marriage?
5.
5 years into your marriage. And then Wendy, you were a worship leader with Reese, this very popular, celebrated guy leading people into the presence of God, and you were on the worship team. And then at some point, it started to become more than colleagues. Do you want to tell that story, how that happened?
Sure. Yeah, I came out of a situation with my local church body that became toxic. It started out to be a really pure, beautiful move of God, where we were really getting a download of what Father was and being healed over our father issues and what Father God meant to us. And so I call it my true born again experience. Even though I grew up believing and in the church and having a relationship, this was a real eye-opening moment for me. So it was really precious, sweet time. And then things just took a bad turn, as sometimes happens with movements. There's misunderstandings. There are factions against factions. And unfortunately, my local body broke up and disbanded. So I was at a place where I was just flailing around by myself, looking for some place to call home again. And then I just happened upon the church that Reese and Sharon went to. I started to experience some areas of healing as far as my relationship, with my view of church again. And I became part of the worship team. Actually, right before that, there's a national prayer event every year, and I was asked to sing for it. And I had written a song that I thought, oh, this would be a great song for me to bring to Reese, ask him if he could work with me collaboratively and come up with, the orchestration of the song. So we did. We worked on the song together. It was a really powerful song, and sat down at the church steps after we finished rehearsing it, and we just had a conversation. It was all above board at this point, and there was nothing intentional in either of us at that point. We were just sharing, and out of that conversation came our displeasure with things that we've seen in the church institution that we both shared, our probably the deep-seated things in us that we wanted to see come about in our experience with church and one another as believers. And so it was a very deep conversation, and we both, I think, found in that moment another person that understood. I think we both felt a little isolated in how we felt at that point, that nobody else quite got us. But in that moment when we shared, we connected. So I left that meeting I was very excited. I would tell people, oh, I met this person, he's a worship leader. We're totally on the same page, creatively and spiritually. I was just excited because for the first time after the church split up, I found someone I could connect with on these levels. And so again, time went on. I was part of the worship team.
And you were married at the time?
Were you married?
Oh, was
No,
I married?
you.
No, I was single.
Okay. All right.
Had never been in a serious relationship.
Okay.
And I was becoming friends with Sharon. I would come over to their house for special evenings, events. We'd have dinner, whatever. We just became really good friends. And the moment, I think the turning point then was I was actually on my way to go see a friend who was also a worship leader. And we spent kind of an evening of I wouldn't say it was a date, but maybe it was a first date. We just connected. And again, I was getting to know him, and I was excited about this new relationship. Maybe it could be something potential. And I shared it with Reese just as a friend. And I told him about this great evening that we had. We sat at the piano, we were playing music, and it was just a really lovely time. And I guess it sparked something in him that festered. And one day I was at work and he gave me a phone call. And I think in an effort to rid himself of the torment that he was feeling, that he had these feelings emerging in him for me, he disclosed how he felt. And I don't know how else to describe it other than it just ignited and turned on this light in me. I had a need, and I think Sharon and I both kind of talk about this need in us to feel special, to feel like beautiful and desired.
Pursued and desired, yes.
And so
Yes.
for the first time in my life, I felt it and I didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it began.
And again, talking to those who are watching, what's so typical here is I've seen it so often is that affairs are usually gradual. It's not this overwhelming lust or even this overwhelming infatuation. A lot of times it's a few conversations. You find a place where you click, which is why little steps lead to big places. As soon as you start sharing things, or he gets me or she gets me, like one else does, you're already going down that slippery slope. And let me also say to the men and women watching, if you have feelings for someone who isn't your spouse, and studies show, I think this is a little bit high, but studies show that it's very likely you could become, if you have a long-term marriage, infatuated with 5 or 6 people other than your spouse. Mm-hmm. That's not a sin. It can happen in interaction or with ministry, but here's the sin: sharing that with the person you're infatuated with. If you have feelings like that, one of the worst things Reese did was to share it
Right.
with Wendy. He should have gone to a pastor. He should have gone to a friend, a counselor. Then the counselor could talk to him about whether it was wise and how to share that with Sharon. But the worst, I'm just telling you, please listen to me. This will spare you a lot of pain. The worst thing you can do, feel those feelings, and then you share it with the person you're having feelings with. That often creates what you see, the mutual, now the door is open. And so we have this affair starting on the worship team at a church. It just didn't influence these two couples. It influenced the entire church body,
Right.
and the ripples go out very far. So, Reese, you were the father of one, and the affair started. Let's not get into specifics. When did it become physical, and if so, when?
Not long after it started.
Okay.
We were kind of collaborating administratively on a CD that I was recording. So I needed to spend a lot of time with her, artwork
Yes,
and, all the things that go along with that. So I would run things over to her house and show her stuff. And eventually we would entertain those conversations again and again. I would say probably by the end of 2000, like my daughter wasn't even a year old yet. And by the end of 2000, things had crossed the line, probably November, December of that year.
And then how long did this go on while you were still trying to make things work with Sharon? Because eventually you conceived another child.
Right. Well, I went back actually on 9/11. Most people understood it to be terrorism. I thought it was the rapture. It's just one of those things that just because of where I was living and in my sin, it was a catalyst for me to go back home. It just scared me enough to go back home and say, we need to start this up again. And Wendy was my biggest advocate for that in a way. She understood, she knew that actually is the better path. It needed to happen.
I would encourage him to, we would sit together in my apartment and I would say, you need to go back.
Yeah.
This isn't right. I mean, God was all the while working on our conscience,
Right.
He knew it was wrong.
Right.
Right.
So I would say, you need to get her flowers, do something, just go.
Yeah. and it, that was an off and on thing. We kind of went to counseling a very small amount. And I wasn't ready for any of this. That's the thing. I was so cold, so hardened, so broken, so burned out. But it was probably, I think, after that had taken place a few months later, around New Year's Eve, it is where my best guess, I believe, because I went down to meet her and her family who were taking some time off over the holiday season. And I went to spend time with them. And at that moment, I believe that's when it happened. We became sexually involved again and conceived the next son or the next child. And it was a little boy. But in the midst of all of that, my heart was so torn emotionally. I knew, what I needed to do, what was right to do, but I just did not have the desire in me to go in that direction. Kind of the damage had been done. I experienced what I experienced over here, and it felt like it was really meeting, deeper needs in my life. I felt heard. I felt listened to. All of these things were just building and building and building. And it was just the momentum was in the direction of Wendy and not Sharon. And when I found out that she had conceived and was expecting, this immediate feeling of claustrophobia came over me. And I felt locked in. I felt like I couldn't go experience what I was experiencing over with the relationship with Wendy. I was going to have to let that go, give it up, and stay home and try and make it work. And eventually what happened is my desire to be with Wendy won out. And I actually walked out on a little baby and a pregnant woman.
Sharon, I imagine how devastating this could be, that you've given birth to a child with this man, you've conceived a child, you're trying to do your best to hold your family together, and yet you're being compared to a single woman who doesn't have the responsibilities, doesn't have the challenges that you have. This must have been a devastating season for you to hear all of this.
It was, absolutely. Because I was still in that place, as Wendy alluded, of feeling, oh, there's something wrong with me anyway. You know, I was the queen of comparison. So, you know, even though I was angry and confused about the situation, I really was turning a lot of it inward. And it was just kind of increasing the shame on my life. But it was absolutely devastating. The first time around, I still felt hope. I had fight. Again, he was so well loved in the church. We had all night prayer vigils. People were praying and fasting for him to come to his senses. And that just helped me hold on to hope. I definitely was dealing with depression, getting my own counseling, you know, trying to deal with my own stuff and being a pregnant single mom. But there was hope. And so when 9/11 happened, I just really felt like when he came back that it was an answer to prayer. And I was not listening to counsel of, you know, holding him to accountability and not taking him back so easily. To me, again, that naivety was just, you know, God's answering prayer, and I'm just going to let him back in with open arms. And it was hard. Like, his heart never really did come back. I knew his heart was very, very divided, but I just got married for better, for worse. And I just felt like we were going to overcome this. And it's a blur when I first conceived Liam, how I felt about the whole thing, but I just really felt like God was going to restore. It was the second time around. Reese kept it pretty well hidden, although every discerning bone in my body knew everything was wrong. He kept it fairly well hidden. Wendy called me up. She felt like it was fair that I knew what was going on, and she pretty much divulged the nature of their relationship, and that
when did this happen? This is the first time you found out that Wendy was a part of his life?
Well, I knew all along. I mean, even when she was coming into our home after that National Day of Prayer, all kinds of bells and whistles and sirens were going off in my heart. But I thought I was just being a jealous, petty wife. And I knew that she was coming out of her own place of hurt from the church. And so I just wanted to be her friend and help her heal. And so I tried to take that stance, but all along it was like, there's something wrong here. And I felt it. So the first time around, I did confront Maurice. Like, it became so obvious that they were together. And so we were in two separate bedrooms. We were hardly communicating. The tension in our marriage was it was beyond bad. And, but I was so afraid to hear the words affair. I was so afraid to admit it. It was like my worst fear. But I had a lot of people encouraging me, counseling me. So I mustered up all the courage I could to ask just straight out, are you having an affair with Wendy? And of course he admitted to that. And he said, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, just go be with her. You know, what's stopping you? So that was the first time around, when Lydia was close to a year. Then he comes back, 9/11. I'm 4 months pregnant. Then when Wendy felt like, I need to know what's going on. And so she shared after he had come back. So this is like a year after the first initial leaving. This would be 2002 at this point. So that was more devastating the first, because the first time around I had hope. And I felt really duped. I felt stupid. I felt dumb. I just had every horrible emotion going through me. And it was at that point that I felt suicidal. I didn't know how in the world I was gonna be a single mom to two. I just had every murderous thought going on in my head, you know, towards me and everybody. It was a really, really dark night that second time. I really lost hope and just felt, in the boxing ring that I was knocked out for the count for sure.
I think it's important to point out, just to show the astonishing grace and forgiveness and reconciliation that follows, the depth of Sharon's hurt. Wanting to be pursued, her own issues, wanting to be accepted, finding out devastatingly that her husband has his heart with someone else after she has a child. And then because she wants it to be true, she's praying, she's fasting that her marriage will be saved. And when you want something to be true, it's easy to believe it is true, even if it's not. So he comes back and she opens herself up to him again, and she gives herself to him again, emotionally and physically. She becomes pregnant. So now sitting in for the long haul. And notice how earlier, this wasn't just one betrayal, that she brought Wendy into her home. And she wanted to minister to Wendy out of a good heart. She wanted to be a friend and a sister in Christ to Wendy. And then to realize she'd been betrayed by these two people who were called to lead her into worship. This is, I just want to pause and emphasize and underline and italicize the depth of this hurt is enormous. That leads her to depression. And does she even want to go on? So you're pregnant. Reese is now back with Wendy for good at this point. You're stumbling along. When, Sharon, does Tim come into the picture?
A long time.
So we'll hold up on that for a
Yeah.
while. So you're struggling along there as a single mom. You've lost your husband. You've been betrayed. Reese, you and Wendy are now starting a new life together.
Right.
And when does the grace part start? How far after, go back the second time, did God start to bring this reconciliation through, and what started that?
Well, eventually, like a breaking point came when I received an email from Sharon. I was Wendy and I were living together, and I received an email from Sharon that says, listen, all you have to do is go over to this law office, sign on the dotted line, and it'll be done. No contest divorce. This is the official 9-year mark of the marriage. And I was down on the floor, just crying on my knees. I just felt weak. I dropped to the floor. I was crying. She runs in and well, not runs in, but she's walking through to do something and sees me on the floor of the office, just crying. And she's like, oh my gosh, what's the matter? And this is what I said to her. I looked up at her and looked at her eyes, and I said, all I ever wanted to do in my life was serve God. And there was this, I think then a little bit of healing started to happen. I knew I wasn't going back home. And eventually, probably about a year later, Wendy and I got married and just began our life together. There was a real season of dryness and desert leading up to that. There was a real season of dryness and desert after the marriage for a number of years. A lot of it had taken toll on Wendy, among other stressors in her life. And as a bull in a china shop would do, I picked up the phone thinking that we were just further along in this healing that, of the relationship, because everything that we had done from then on, anytime that we had done anything together, it was all for the children. And we made sure that they were never going to be the target of any of this other stuff. We were going to protect them. We were going to continue to pour into them. And so I probably had a bit of a false sense of security about how strong our relationship was and how we're all getting over it and all healing. And so one day, Wendy is feeling incredibly stressed. She's got knots all up and down her neck.
I know where you're going to go. Before we get to that, though, let me bring Wendy back in here.
Yeah.
If you're wondering, don't leave. We're going to find a scene where Sharon literally has her hands around Wendy's neck and God enters the room. But that's the Corey Ten Boom moment we were talking about. But let me go back to Wendy for a little bit, because you love the Lord. You came out of an abusive church, so you had your own hurts. And here you are wanting to worship God and write songs for him, to lead other people to worship him. And you eventually somehow have to come to grips that I'm taking a dad away from 2 kids, one not yet born, and another woman, a sister in Christ. How did you deal with that? Were you just repressing things toward yourself? I mean, how did you feel toward Sharon? What just kind of explain the spiritual dynamics of that?
I had such a heart to serve God, and I think that was the hardest thing for me to get over, was that I sinned in the face of the one I loved most. And that was really hard for me to get over. I became, throughout the whole thing, when 9/11 happened, I got into a very deep and dark place in my mind. I became very suicidal. I made 2, if not 3 attempts on my life, and all unsuccessful, thank God, but I became extremely dark because I disappointed God. I disappointed my family. I disappointed and hurt Sharon. I did something I swore I would never do. And how can a person live their whole life saying, this is my high ground and I'll never do it, do that very thing? So it was very hard for me to come to grips with for many, many years. It hasn't been until the last few years that I've been at peace with it. I still don't like to share it because I don't like the person that was. You know, it was so out of character for me. Even members of my own family kind of put me on this pedestal that I was this spiritual leader as the youngest sibling. And then I was some strong rock, and I fell so far. So it was very hard, very dark. I was embarrassed. Like, it was a very awkward place to be in because the kids were involved, and I knew that was most important. We never wanted to take it out on them. So I would go to events, school events, concerts, sporting events, and Sharon was there, and Reese was there, and I was there. And it just, it was very awkward all the time. But I just had to swallow it. I just had to be the bigger person in the moment and encourage the kids and encourage their relationship with their mom and dad. And that was it. So it was awkward, difficult, hard. None of it was glorious. None of it was at all what was in my mind when this started.
Right.
And it all hit really hard, I think, when we got married. Then I really realized the scope and depth and breadth of this. And we had to try to make it work then.
As the best-selling book states, the body knows the score.
Mhm.
And I said that because that's probably what led up to the tension that Reese is about to talk about. And again, I just want those who are watching, you can really love the Lord and go off the rails.
Mhm.
Just because you worship God and love God doesn't mean that you can start to make little compromises and not be carried in an avalanche. We're fallen people. Every one of us have the ability to betray and to hurt and to go against everything that we hold most dear, but it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Wendy didn't do the spiritual work. She wasn't strong enough to say, I'm not going to be party to breaking up a family. So she still has in the back of her mind, I'm going to do this. And then getting married, when, can we just say, in God's eyes, it wasn't a legitimate marriage, but I'm not saying it's not legitimate now, but at that point, a pastor would have told both of them, no, you break up, Reese, you be reconciled to your wife.
Mhm.
Not dealing with that leads, well, so first you have the suicidal thoughts, this is wrong, I can't believe I did that, but then getting together with him, and then still that guilt. Grace hasn't been applied yet. Power of the Holy Spirit hasn't come in. She's just got condemnation and whatnot, and that works its way into our body. And so she's at a place where there's tension and there's knots. And Reese, who now is a counselor, he's a different man. He's a mature man. He understands these things, but he realizes it was a bit almost ridiculously blind that you would call up Sharon and say what?
Well, Sharon was and is a massage therapist. And I thought, I'm a resource guy. I'm a connector. It's just my nature.
I don't mean to laugh. It's just
No, it's fine.
It's just so bad.
We're all laughing.
we still laugh at this whole thing. So I called Sharon up and I said, hey, you're a massage therapist and I have someone that's in need of massage therapy. It just happens to be Wendy. And really, just unbeknownst to me, I didn't realize the gravity of that moment in time as far as the story goes. And so I called and I asked her if she would do that. And Sharon said, I'll have to think about it. and I thought, makes sense. I kind of came back to planet Earth and I said, sure, yeah, no problem. You know, if not, we'll go somewhere else. Not a big issue. I just thought I would call you first and see if you were available. I reserve the time now for Sharon to express the next part of that story, because this is where it gets fun.
Well, I do have to go back though, because this wasn't just a random call on, out of thin air. It was definitely on a timeline of my own journey of forgiving. I thought I had forgiven Maurice like pretty early on, but I discovered through the years that it really was kind of sweeping all the emotions and all the feelings under the carpet, which just really kind of fueled a lot of depression, very functional depression, but depression nonetheless for years and years. But I was very aware of my lack of forgiveness for Wendy. And that's what ate at me. That's what I was very conscious about. And at first, just because of the type of counseling I was getting, I knew how important forgiveness was for my own well-being. And so my first steps toward forgiveness really was for my own well-being. I wanted to be okay. I didn't want that toxic unforgiveness in my heart. I have to say it was pretty selfish in the beginning. But I wanted to get to the point where I could love Wendy and be okay at all the sporting events and school concerts and birthday parties, because I wasn't. It was hard. It was awkward for her. It was awkward for me. I didn't like it. And so it was a journey for years, really. And there were a couple times where I just felt compelled to write a letter to her, just stating my desire to forgive her and wanting to forgive her and choosing to love her. And I just felt like with every attempt, maybe it would get easier. But it was a journey. And then I got to the place where God challenged me, are you willing to forgive her and fully release this, even if you never hear the words, I'm sorry? And I think since that time, I've come to grasp the whole, the piece of the Lord's Prayer, which says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. I never understood that. I'm like, why doesn't he just say sin? I don't understand like this whole concept of debt. But I heard it recently explained that a debt is something that's owed you. And I felt like she owed me a huge apology. And I think she was too broken up on the inside to even, put it into words. But I didn't understand that. I just felt like that she owes me that. And, how can I be her friend and keep going on as, I felt like the third wheel, at these kids events. So I had to get to a point where I let go of my right of ever hearing her say, I'm sorry, and I was wrong. And so for me, it was years of God challenging me to lay it down, to forgive, to go to new depths of forgiveness. So I finally got to this place, I guess enough, where I said, to the Lord, if I never hear those words, I choose to forgive her, and I'm going to choose to go on. And I would say it was within days of coming to that place with the Lord that Wendy called me on the phone and said the words that I had longed to hear for years. And I didn't know what to do. I'm like, I hadn't rehearsed what I was going to say back. I'm like, oh, what do I say? You know, there's so many emotions involved here with this. And all I knew to say was, I forgive you. Thank you. And I think, you know, we just hung up the phone like, okay, now what do we say? So we hung up the phone. I'm like, oh my goodness, wow, it's over. I thought it was over. Like this journey of forgiveness was over. Until then the next day, it was the next day after this conversation with Wendy that Maurice calls me. So it was not by accident. Because when I hung up then from him and I said, I'll think about giving her a massage. I'm like, you know, I hang up and I just talk with God, like, really? What am I supposed to do here? You know, this seems a little extreme. And I really felt, I heard as clear as day, did you really forgive her?
Wow.
And I felt like it was a test. And so I called them up and said, I'll do it. So that's the place that we want to be here. So she's in my massage room, the lights are dim, the music's playing. She's on my table. I scoot up on my stool and like literally my hands are going around her neck. Because I know, you know, it's headaches,
Yeah,
it's neck tension. This is the area, you know, that we need to work on. And you know, I can do all this with my eyes closed. I've been a massage therapist at this point for years, and I can get on autopilot with these things. But I felt like God just hit the pause button and said, look at what's happening here. Years ago, I really literally wanted to, you know, wring her neck and bring harm to her. And now he was helping me choose to bring healing to her. And he didn't allow me to miss that moment, because I think I could have very easily, like, well, just get on autopilot, get through this. And, you know, just let's get on the other side of this. But God very intentionally hit that pause button in the spirit, like, look what's happening here. And I think it was kind of more, I don't know if she really got that much healing or relief from a headache that day, but I think it was so powerful what started happening in the spirit between the two of us. And it really would take more years, because I was still struggling with the fact that I was a single mom. I so much wanted to see God's restoration in my own life. I was really broken in the area of men. And so I was kind of in and out of a lot of relationships, you know, just trying to find that fulfillment and somebody that would help me raise children. And I was very kind of hyper focused on that. So it just kind of kept me in this loop of not being able to fully let go of what had happened. I don't know how much you want to fast forward.
Just let me add, I mean, this is where the forgiveness is so extraordinary. You were dealing with not every day, every hour, the consequences of what Reese and Wendy had done. You're a single mom. You're bearing a weight that no woman should have to bear. And to not continue to smolder in resentment and to go there literally with your hands around Wendy's, but then God to break through. And it's this moment. Did you feel this release then, where you felt like there's something different? What was going on inside at that point?
I think looking back, I think it was just the continuum on a timeline of these levels of forgiveness. I felt like God just continued to challenge me on new levels of forgiveness. I feel like as Christians, as believers, we can think, oh, I said, I forgive you, or I chose to forgive this person at the altar, and then that's all I have to do, and we walk away. But I think in my situation, I really learned that forgiveness is a journey. And it takes a long time for our emotions to catch up with the choice.
Yeah, sure.
And so for me, it was years and years of choosing. And this was part of that. it was part of allowing my emotions to catch up, because in that moment, I really was choosing healing, and I really did have compassion, and I wanted to see her healed. I can't say like we had gotten the whole way yet, but it definitely was part of the continuum of my emotions starting to line up with my choice.
Now, Wendy, what about you? You're laying there on the table, very vulnerable position. You feel Sharon's hands around your neck. You know what you've done. Did God use this to bring healing to you, to say, if she can forgive you, I've forgiven you? I mean, what, or was it just another massage? What was going on for you spiritually?
This certainly was not just another massage. I think I was, you should be relaxed and relieve stress during massages, but honestly, this wasn't that kind of massage. I was very anxiety ridden. It was, again, awkward, strange. I didn't know how to feel, but I thought I would just receive this. And as it was happening, I didn't feel much different in the moment. I was kind of numbing myself because it was just that weird. But afterwards, I felt like, I started to feel some things breaking off of me. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that were it not for Sharon's work in that area and her bravery to say to me, I forgive you, I could not have continued my journey in the same way of forgiveness for myself. It was the catalyst for me. It was the spark that enabled me then to look and say, wow, okay, now I can forgive myself. It wasn't necessarily that I couldn't receive forgiveness from God. I knew he forgave me, but I couldn't forgive myself. So Sharon's act toward me was what enabled me to forgive me.
It's so beautiful. It's why I love the gospel. It's why I love life in Christ, because the story of forgiveness here isn't just Sharon forgiving Wendy or Sharon forgiving Reese. It's Wendy forgiving Wendy and Reese forgiving Reese. And can we just be honest? James 3:2 says we all stumble in many ways. We all are going to have to forgive ourselves. There are episodes of my marriage where it's been hard for me to forgive myself. How could I treat my wife this way? So all of us need to learn the power of grace. We're not always the people we want to be, but God is always the God we need him to be.
Yeah.
And sometimes he brings these extraordinary servants like Sharon. And Sharon, I do think you're an extraordinary woman of God.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Tim would agree. I can just see it in his face.
Yep, you got it.
That reveals to us the power of the truth that we believe, the power of the God that we love, the power of the grace that we've received. And just because of time, I got to keep us moving on, but let's move forward. Extraordinary act of forgiveness. But thank you, Sharon, that it's not a one-time thing. Even the massage, it was this journey of continuing to forgive. God brings Tim into your life. That must have felt like a gift.
Yeah, that's a loaded story as well. I would like to just touch on one more point with the massage, if I may.
Sure.
Fast forward another few years, she comes in, we have Wendy come in again, with these ongoing headaches. And at this point I am with Tim, and we're dating, and we know that this is God's restoration. Like this, God's really restoring and redeeming in my life, which really helped me the most to let go of the past. And so she is in my massage room again, and we're talking, and things have really gotten a lot freer between the two of us. So we were talking much freer at this point. And Wendy at this point says, Sharon, I really have to admit to you, I know these knots are my own inability to forgive myself. Mm-hmm. And even though there was probably a start of that at that first time I chose to massage her, I mean, I know myself, I'm my worst critic. It's hard to forgive yourself. I think that's the hardest sometimes. So here years later, she's admitting to me that she's having a hard time forgiving herself for everything. And so I felt like I was allowed into this holy moment with her. Now that God was really, truly restoring in my life, to, not that I could give her permission, but almost like say, you can forgive yourself. Like, God is so good. He's restoring in my life. And it's just so good. And he's so good. You have to let go. You have to forgive yourself. And so we were able to really talk about our own journeys with shame and what that looked like on both sides of the fence, and how much women in general need to hear our story. So it was at that point that I could say, I love this woman. I have affection for this woman. There's no more angst. There's no more whatever, negative emotion I felt. I love her, and I really truly have compassion for everything that she's had to go through herself. And I think both of our hearts at that point was like, we want to see shame broken off of every woman, no matter what side of the fence she's on. So I don't know, maybe we're getting to that, but I just felt like that was really the ultimate. It didn't end with the one massage. I just want to encourage everybody, like, forgiveness is a journey.
Yes.
And it took a lot of years for us to get to that place of my emotions were lining up with all those choices through all those years. And now I love Wendy. I love being around her. We love who she is. I love that she's an amazing stepmom to my kids. Like, there's no more resentment there at all. It's pure love, and that's God. And that's where we can get, if we're willing to take that journey and take all those steps. For us, oh my goodness, that's such a loaded, packed story here. We knew each other for years. In fact, Reese and Tim were colleagues back in the early 90s. So we were on worship teams, and we were doing regional worship events together in the early 90s. And just through the years, because of the two churches and the roles that we had in the two churches, our paths crossed a lot. And post-divorce, then the matchmakers started. We had lots of matchmakers through the years. And, for one reason or another, it just wasn't time yet for us. It just wasn't time yet. Like, we tried, there were several times that we tried, and it just wasn't clicking. But I would say 2014, it was time for like the big guns and like major intervention. We had the pastor's wife of Life Center, where Maurice had led worship, and I had attended for 23 years at that point. The pastor's wife of the church that we belong to now, that Tim pastors at, and then another really godly woman. We were all together. I was massaging actually all of them at this little spa party, and they were like, Sharon, you need to really pray about this whole Tim thing. And they all had their little scoop. They all had their little piece, and they were all really encouraging me that I needed to go back and really pray and open my heart up to this. Because I don't know, it's such a long, complicated story. I'm trying to sum it up. And maybe he can share a little bit of his piece. But after that fun spa party where I was ganged up on, like, Sharon, we're only asking you to pray about this. It took a little while till I prayed again, like, God, if this is you, can you just open the door and make it natural and untried? I don't want to be playing around. I don't want to hurt his heart. I don't, this has got to be you, clearly. And so a few weeks later, he reached out, and we eventually had coffee, and it was so right, and it was so natural, and it was God's perfect timing. So, I mean, we were divorced in 2004, Maurice and I, and this was 2014. So it was 10 years of a lot of healing, a lot of dating the wrong guy and learning the hard way. And just God doing this process in my heart of being whole enough, to win the heart of this guy who's absolutely amazing. So yeah, it was quite the journey to get here, but wow, it was worth it. Worth all the work, all the work.
Tim, I'm sure we could do an hour show just with you on this story, but just tell me in a couple sentences, because really this is a story about God's forgiveness and grace. And there's so many angles we don't have time to explore, but just the blessing of being married to a woman of forgiveness, how that set up your marriage now to succeed.
Yeah.
Because bitterness, although understandable, is so destructive to going forward. But I'm sure you've experienced the blessings of a woman who's free to give herself to you, even though she'd been hurt so deeply.
Yeah, because Reese and I would do these worship leader gatherings, we were colleagues, so we knew each other fairly well through the 90s. And so when I heard about the affair, I was just completely shocked. I was like, I would have never seen that coming in a million years. So then fast forward a few years after the divorce had happened, people started matching us up, and I said, there's not a chance in the world. I don't want to get in all that. That's a mess. and I'm not marrying into this mess. Not a chance in the world. You know? So, but I'll be honest with you, Gary, that guys, Reese and Wendy, I don't know what I've said to you about this, so this might be new info to you today, but I just knew that there was an affair. I didn't know, can you massage this, that, this, I didn't know all the little intricacies in there. Oh, she was in your home. I didn't know all these things. So through our marriage, even while we were dating, but especially since we've been married, just having very open discussions, and Sharon would just share some of these things. And she's recently, she's finishing up a book, writing this story, and I've read through it. And I think I even learned something brand new just even a couple months ago about this through the journey. And I've been amazed and blessed to see what true forgiveness really looks like. And I have to be honest, I don't know if I was in Sharon's shoes, if this discussion would be happening right now. She's stronger than I would have ever imagined, and very full of grace. We have this saying that we use around here: when you drop a can of paint and the paint splatters, in other words, when you make a mess and you do something, you need to go clean up everyone who's gotten splattered by your paint dropping. And I just even recently heard a story of someone that Reese and probably Wendy and Sharon have known for decades, who heard Sharon and I preach a sermon last summer on this topic of forgiveness and the journey of it. And recently said, it was when you shared, Sharon, that testimony, that I was able to actually go to the altar of forgiveness myself for Reese because of what he did to you. And this was, guys, if this was just a year ago, how many years is that now? I mean, that's that many years. And the beauty of it is, as this friend of ours told us this, I just started thinking about what the word testimony means. The word testimony means do it again. And when somebody hears a testimony like this, it has the capacity and the power to bring us all, whether we were involved in an affair, or we had an issue with our father, or we had an issue with a close friend or a church leader, that it stirs it up in us to see God do it again, to see God bring us all to an altar of a place where we can walk in a place of grace and forgiveness. And so I'm blessed every day to call this woman my wife, for more ways than just this, but this has been a big factor in our lives of how she's modeled that.
Tim, that's an amazing 3 or 4 minute sermon. we could almost end right there. That's phenomenal. You haven't had a big role here, but certainly a significant one. But let's just try to wrap this up. Today, you guys vacation together. And aren't you kind of vacationing right now? You're in the same place?
We were, this particular week, they were away on a vacation, Sharon and Tim, and then our children, and they needed someone to house sit. because and take care of their puppy and water their plants. And we were coming up anyways for another reason. And she goes, would you mind coming up a few days earlier? You can have the whole house to yourself. And we're like, yeah, we could use a break. So that's what we
Who
were
does
doing.
that, Gary?
I
does
know,
that?
I know. It's just like, open up your home to that.
We do holidays together. Who does
We do.
that?
We do. We have a blast on Christmas. We have a blast when we're able to get together for birthdays, because we live in Florida now. But when we do come up, for graduation events, all that kind of stuff, it's just it's an amazing time. And I'm honored to still be able to call them in one way family, because we are family. Their name is Spirk. Our name is Crane. We refer to the kids and their puppy as the Sprains, just kind of putting the names together. But one thing I want to say, Gary, really quick, is that I watched Sharon date, a couple of guys, and there was one that we thought was going to be serious and it didn't work out. And she was really hurt by that. And so I began to pray, Lord, and I didn't even know that Tim was even in the running, at least in heaven, for this position. But I was praying for a long time. And I said, God, send Sharon a man who will love her the way she deserves to be loved. Kind of one of those Bruce Almighty moments, and I said, but if you don't mind, please give her someone that will love my children with his whole heart. And I can't praise this guy enough. He's an amazing man of God, but even so, he has become just a true, I don't even call him a stepdad. Maybe
Bonus
in
dad.
Conversations.
He's a bonus dad.
He's a bonus dad. Yeah. So,
I like that.
but he's an amazing man, and just the role that he took in pouring into my kids, it's absolutely incredible to see. I've learned from him how to be a better father to my kids, and I appreciate that about him. And one other thing that just hit me while we were talking here is my freedom from my addiction, my porn and sex addiction, came probably on the heels of all of this stuff that was taking place. That timeline measures up now. I broke free about 10 years ago after having an encounter with Christ that was pretty powerful. And he set me free, lock, stock, and barrel in that moment. I didn't kind of go the recovery route, but that's what he chose to do for me. But I was just sitting here putting the timeline together going, wow, he hit all of us at around the same time and broke us free for such a day as this.
Yeah.
So I'm so honored and blessed that his love reached down into all of our dark places and brought us to a place of healing and freedom.
And that's really the story here. The story here is God wins.
Yeah.
We all mess up in many ways. We're all hurting in many ways. And God comes through in his power and his love and his mercy and in his grace. And Sharon, we've heard your astonishing story, but Wendy, you demonstrated to us humility, that you would be open about this and share your own hurts and your desire. And then all of us need to learn how to forgive ourselves. And by you being so open, we're learning, okay, yeah, we may do things that we just despise. How could I do that? But we have to receive God's mercy as well.
Yes.
And forgive ourselves. And Reese, you're the classic example of a guy who was so hurt, responded in terrible ways, caused great hurt, but got healed, did forgiveness, and now you're helping other guys get out of what caused you so much trouble. Right. And then Sharon and Tim, God shows how when we're hurt, what the locusts have stolen, God restores a great relationship without bitterness. Just through this, God wins and God reigns. And I thank you all for showing this and demonstrating this. Wendy, did you have one thing that you really felt like?
You made a comment that the scripture that had been so instrumental in a pivot point for me was that the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know its secret motives? And that was me. And like, we just can't always trust our own selves, our own hearts, and our intentions, that it can deceive us. And you're right, that God won in that moment. Then he brought it all back around for his glory.
And it's the lesson we all have to learn. In the end, there's one hero. His name is Jesus.
Yeah.
We all receive his grace, and we're all called to give his grace. And I just want to thank both of you couples for demonstrating that every day that you live, that you could show in the face of great hurt and betrayal, there can be joy and happiness and laughter and even vacations. So thank you all for spending this time. And
Thank
let's thank God for being the author of this story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.